Blood smells like rusted iron and bad decisions. Camden knew this because it was currently plastered across her cheek, drying into a tight crust that pulled at her skin every time she blinked. They were pinned in a dried-out ravine, 70 miles from anywhere that mattered, taking plunging fire from 3 ridges. 4 SEALs left, 60 hostiles closing in. They were dead. Everybody knew it, until the first gunner dropped from the ridge, a neat hole punched through his skull, and the high-ground executioner quietly went to work. Gravel bit into Camden's knees as she pressed herself against the crumbling limestone wall of the ravine. The rock was baking hot, radiating a dry, suffocating heat that made the air shimmer. Every time a round snapped overhead, tiny shards of shale rained down, dusting her shoulders in a fine, chalky powder that coated the back of her throat. She swallowed. It tasted like ash. To her left, Hayes was trying to stuff a wad of combat gauze into the gap between Gallagher's body armor and his ribcage. Gallagher wasn't screaming. That was the worst part. He was just making this wet, rhythmic hitching sound, like a broken engine trying to turn over. Bubbles of pink froth formed at the corner of his lips, popping softly in the dust. "Hold it down," Hayes grunted, his voice entirely devoid of the command it usually carried. His hands were slick, sliding off the pressure point. "Camden, give me your tape. Mine's gone." Camden didn't look at him. She couldn't take her eyes off the ridgeline. Her M4 was braced against a jagged notch in the rock, the barrel radiating heat through her tactical gloves. Her thumb was blistering where it rested against the metal, but she didn't move it. The pain kept her anchored. It kept the ringing in her ears from pulling her under. "Tape, Cam," Hayes barked, his voice cracking. She reached down with her left hand, keeping the weapon shouldered, fumbling at her chest rig by touch alone. She ripped the roll of duct tape from its carabiner and tossed it backward. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. Down the line, Reed was curled around the SATCOM radio, his face pressed against the handset. He wasn't talking. He was just listening to the static. The hiss of dead air was louder than the gunfire right now. "Nothing," Reed said, his voice flat. He looked up, and Camden saw that his helmet strap was hanging loose, severed by a piece of shrapnel that had also taken a neat slice out of his jawline. He didn't seem to notice he was bleeding. "Overcast is blocking the signal, or they jammed the relay. Either way, nobody's coming." Camden let out a slow breath. Her lungs felt tight, constrained by the heavy ceramic plates of her carrier. She had 60 rounds left, 3 magazines, a pistol with 10 in the pipe. Above them, the chatter of the DSHK heavy machine gun started up again. The sound wasn't a roar. It was a physical weight, a jackhammer pounding directly against her sternum. The rounds chewed into the lip of the ravine, sending a shower of pulverized rock down on them. Camden squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away as the debris pelted her goggles. When she opened her eyes, she looked at Gallagher. He had stopped making the hitching noise. His chest was perfectly still. Hayes was just kneeling there, his bloody hands resting uselessly on his thighs, staring at the tape he hadn't had time to use. They were out of options. They were in a bowl, and the enemy had the rim. Tactical manuals had a lot of names for this scenario, but Camden's brain, currently running on adrenaline and dehydration, could only supply one: a butcher's block. She didn't feel heroic. She didn't feel a sudden surge of patriotic defiance. She just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep annoyance. She thought about her apartment back in Virginia Beach. She had left a coffee cup on the counter. The milk in it was going to sour. She had meant to wash it, but the deployment call had come, and she'd rushed out the door. Now she was going to die in a trench that smelled heavily of copper and voided bowels. And her landlord was going to have to clean up curdled milk. It pissed her off. "How many on the East Ridge?" she asked, her voice rasping like sandpaper. 2 dozen, Reed muttered, dropping the radio handset. He pulled his rifle into his lap, wiping the dust from the bolt carrier with a thumb that trembled violently. "Maybe 30 on the north. They're taking their time. Why rush?" "They're waiting for the sun to drop," Hayes said. He wiped his bloody hands on his pants, leaving dark, rust-colored streaks on the multicam fabric. He looked at Camden. His eyes were completely hollowed out. The leader was gone. There was just a tired man left. "Sun goes behind the peaks in 20 minutes. It blinds our optics. Then they walk down and finish it." Camden checked her optic. The red dot hovered sharply over the dusty rock face ahead. "Then we don't wait." Sweat pooled in the hollow of Camden's collarbone, acidic and sharp. She rolled her shoulders, feeling the chafing of the heavy pack straps digging into her bruised skin. If they stayed in the ravine, they would be fish in a barrel. If they pushed up the scree slope, they would be moving targets against an open backdrop. Death by firing squad, or death by a slow, bleeding crawl. "We push the West Gap," Camden said. She didn't look back at Hayes or Reed. Looking at them meant acknowledging how few of them were left. "It's a choke point. The heavy gun can't depress far enough to hit the trench there. We take out the spotters on the way up. We might bleed through into the tree line." "That's a suicide run," Reed said flatly. "We're already dead, Reed. We're just deciding how we look for the coroner." She popped her magazine out, checking the brass casing sitting at the top of the stack. It was scuffed, dirty. She slammed it back in, the metallic clack loud in the momentary lull of gunfire. "Leave Gallagher," Hayes ordered, his voice returning to a low, mechanical rasp. "Pull his tags, smash the radio." Reed leaned over, yanking the dog tags over Gallagher's helmet. They came loose with a harsh snap of the chain. He didn't close Gallagher's eyes. It wasn't like the movies. When people died, their eyes usually stayed half open, clouded over with dust, looking at nothing at all. Camden hated that look. It reminded her of dead fish on crushed ice at the supermarket. Reed brought the butt of his rifle down on the SATCOM panel. Plastic shattered, circuitry crunching beneath the polymer stock. "On 3, Camden said. She shifted her weight, bringing her right knee under her. Her joints screamed in protest. She hadn't slept in 48 hours. Her muscles were running on a toxic cocktail of cortisol and fear, burning themselves out from the inside. High above, a voice shouted something in a language she didn't speak. It didn't matter. The tone was universal. "Move up, flush them out." The clatter of loose shale echoed down the canyon walls. They were descending. Camden visualized the path. Up and over the lip, sprint 15 meters to the burnt-out husk of a technical truck. Use it for cover, then push the gully. 3 seconds of open exposure. At this range, with 20 guns pointed at them, 3 seconds was a lifetime. She took a breath. The air smelled of cordite, baking stone, and the sharp, sour tang of her own sweat. "1," she whispered. Hayes racked his bolt. 2. Reed swallowed hard, a visible bob of his Adam's apple. Camden tensed her quads, digging her boots into the dirt. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the eastern ridgeline. Not a rifle shot from above them. Something else. The heavy machine gun, which had been laying down a suppressive rhythm every 30 seconds, suddenly stopped mid-burst. Camden froze. She pressed herself back against the rock, holding her breath. "Hold," Hayes hissed, his hand shooting out to grab her shoulder plate. Silence descended on the canyon. It wasn't a peaceful silence. It was the heavy, pregnant quiet of a vacuum forming. Then a body tumbled over the edge of the east ridge. It didn't leap or dive. It fell completely limp, a mass of limbs and tactical gear cartwheeling down the steep rock face. It hit a jagged outcropping halfway down, bounced with a sickening crunch, that carried all the way to the ravine and finally rolled to a stop 50 feet from their position. It was the DSHK gunner. Half his head was missing. The remaining bone and tissue looked like a dropped watermelon. Camden stared at the body. Her brain, wired for immediate threat response, stumbled over the input. Did he misfire? A catastrophic weapon failure. 3 seconds later, the unmistakable, tearing sound of a high-velocity round, ripping through the sound barrier, echoed across the canyon. Crack thump. It came from the far western peak, a mile out, across the valley. Sniper, Reed breathed, flattening himself completely onto the dirt. They have us cross-sighted. No, Camden said, her eyes tracking back to the dead gunner. The entry wound was on the right side of his skull. The angle was facing away from them. Up on the ridge, the enemy fighters erupted into panicked shouting. They were firing wildly now, but not down into the ravine. The muzzle flashes were angled horizontally, shooting at shadows across the expanse. Before the echo of the first shot had even faded, another hostile stood up from behind a rock to yell an order. His chest caved in abruptly, a massive puff of red mist blowing out of his back. He was dead before his knees hit the dirt. Crack thump. The sound arrived again, lagging behind the physics of the kill. Camden lowered her rifle a fraction of an inch. She looked at Hayes. He was staring at the ridge, his mouth slightly open, the blood drying on his face, cracking into a terrible mask. "Who the hell is that?" Hayes whispered. The canyon turned into a slaughterhouse, and the seals were just the audience. Camden lay in the dirt, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched the ridgeline through her optic. The enemy fighters were scrambling, abandoning their positions to seek cover from an angle they couldn't see. Another man tried to sprint between two boulders. He made it exactly 3 steps. His leg buckled backward, severed completely at the knee by a round that struck with the force of a sledgehammer. He went down screaming, clawing at the dirt. A second later, a round took him in the center of the spine. He went limp. Crack thump, crack thump. The pacing was horrifyingly deliberate. It wasn't the frantic spraying of an overwhelmed squad. It was methodical, clinical. It was the rhythm of a worker on an assembly line, driving nails into wood. Find target, adjust, fire, rack bolt. Camden shifted her optic toward the distant western peak. The glare of the sun was blinding, casting the jagged spires of rock into deep, impenetrable shadows. She strained her eyes, looking for muzzle flash, for a glint of a scope, for any disturbance in the dust. Nothing. The mountain was dead quiet. The shooter was concealed so deeply within the terrain that they might as well have been a ghost. 4 down, Reed said, his voice trembling, not with fear anymore, but with a hysterical kind of awe. 5. The hostiles were panicking. Without their heavy gun, and pinned from an unknown elevation, their discipline shattered. A group of 6 broke from the northern ridge, trying to scramble down the backside of the slope to escape the line of sight. The shadow on the hill didn't let them. The first man in the retreat took a round to the pelvis. The hydrostatic shock flipped him completely over. He tumbled into the man behind him, taking them both down in a tangle of limbs. The shooter didn't even pause to confirm the kill. They immediately shifted targets. A third man dropped, his rifle flying from his hands. "Look at the impact spray," Hayes muttered, pointing a blood-crusted finger. "Look at it. That's not a 5.56, that's anti-materiel, a .338 at least, maybe a .50 caliber." Camden watched a puff of rock explode the size of a dinner plate, where an enemy fighter had been standing a millisecond before. The sheer kinetic energy of the impacts was rattling her teeth, even from this distance. "Who operates out here?" Camden asked, her throat dry. "Agency? SAD? Nobody," Hayes replied. "This sector has been a black zone for a year. Command wouldn't even risk drone surveillance because of the anti-air batteries." "Well, someone's up there," Camden said. "Up on the ridge, The remaining fighters realized that running was a death sentence. They huddled behind the thickest shale deposits, trying to lay low. For a long 2 minutes, the canyon was dead silent. The gunfire had stopped. The only sound was the wind howling through the narrows and the ragged breathing of the 3 surviving SEALs. Camden tasted the grit on her teeth. The sweat dripping into her eyes stung horribly, but she refused to blink. A lone fighter, driven mad by the silence or the heat, decided to take a chance. He blindly hoisted an RPG launcher over the top of his cover, aiming in the general direction of the western peak. He didn't even expose his head, just his arms and the tube. The distant sniper didn't shoot his arms. A round slammed directly into the warhead of the RPG. The explosion was blinding. A massive fireball erupted on the ridgeline, the concussive wave washing over the ravine a second later, blowing hot air and burning debris down onto the SEALs. Slabs of rock cracked and slid down the slope. The screaming that followed was wet and terrible, the sound of men burning alive. Camden ducked, throwing her arms over the back of her neck as fragments of metal rained down. When she looked up, a thick plume of black smoke was curling into the sky. The western peak remained completely silent. "Mother of God," Reed whispered. Camden didn't believe in God. She believed in ballistics, gravity, and the fact that you died when you bled out. But right now, looking at the smoke rising from the ridge, she felt a profound, chilling insignificance. They weren't being rescued. The shadow on the hill wasn't calling out on the radio, wasn't coordinating a medevac, wasn't acting like friendly forces. It was just exterminating the threat with the cold, detached efficiency of a gardener pulling weeds. "They're breaking," Hayes said, looking through his binos. "The survivors are crawling back down the far side. They're abandoning the perimeter." Camden slowly rose from her crouch. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet. She looked at the blood on her hands, Gallagher's blood. She looked at the dead bodies littering the slope above them, crumpled like discarded laundry. She turned and faced the western peak. The sun was dipping just behind its jagged crest, casting a long, blinding halo of light around the stone. Somewhere in that light, someone was looking back at her through a piece of glass. She didn't wave. She didn't salute. She just stared, acutely aware that whoever held that rifle had her life perfectly balanced on the tip of their trigger finger, and could take it away just as easily as they had given it back. Dust settled over the canyon in a slow, suffocating veil. It coated the inside of Camden's mouth, gritty and alkaline, tasting heavily of pulverized limestone and burnt propellant. The ringing in her ears had dialed down to a persistent, high-pitched whine, leaving a hollow silence in its wake. Nobody moved. For a long, stretching minute, the 3 surviving SEALs simply stayed pressed against the baking rock of the ravine, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the crosshairs to swing their way. Nothing happened. The western peak remained a jagged black silhouette against the bruising purple of the twilight sky. Camden finally broke the paralysis. She didn't give an order, she just started moving. Her knees popped like dry kindling as she shifted her weight. Every muscle fiber in her thighs screamed in toxic rebellion. She ignored it, crawling on her belly over the loose shale toward Gallagher's body. She didn't look at his face. Looking at the face was a mistake rookies made. You looked at the gear. Her hands, slick with a mixture of sweat and her dead teammates' drying blood, fumbled with the clasps on his chest rig. She yanked his 3 remaining magazines free, shoving them ruthlessly into her own empty pouches. She found his canteen. It was half full. She unscrewed the cap with her teeth, spat the plastic lid into the dirt, and drank. The water was lukewarm and tasted like plastic, but it hit her parched throat like a godsend. She passed it back to Hayes without a word. Hayes took it. His hands were shaking so badly that water spilled down his chin, cutting clean tracks through the grime on his neck. He looked completely unspooled. The man who had flawlessly coordinated a dozen midnight raids in Fallujah was gone, replaced by someone who couldn't stop staring at his own bloody palms. "We need to move," Camden rasped. Her voice sounded strange, like someone scraping a rusty trowel against brick. If they have a QRF, they heard that RPG go off. We have maybe 20 minutes before the valley floor is crawling with technicals. Reed wiped his nose with the back of his wrist. "Where?" "We have no comms, no extraction window. We go up," Camden said, pointing a bruised finger toward the western peak. "We find whoever just bought us a second lease on life, or we take their high ground. We stay in this ditch, we die in it." She didn't wait for a consensus. Consensus was a luxury for boardrooms, not for a three-man element bleeding out in hostile territory. She slung her M4 across her chest and began the agonizing climb out of the ravine. The physical toll of the ascent was immediate and brutal. The slope was composed of loose, razor-sharp scree that gave way with every step. For every 2 feet Camden climbed, she slid back 1, her boots scrambling for purchase. Her left knee, banged up during the initial ambush, throbbed with a dull, rhythmic agony that synced perfectly with her racing heartbeat. Behind her, she heard the heavy, labored breathing of Hayes and Reed. Nobody spoke. Talking required oxygen they didn't have to spare. The air temperature plummeted the moment the sun dipped completely behind the mountains. The suffocating heat of the day vanished, replaced by a biting chills that cut right through their sweat-soaked combat shirts. Camden shivered, her teeth clacking together. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind an exhausting, hollowed-out fatigue. She wanted to lie down in the dirt. She wanted to close her eyes for just 5 minutes. She imagined the cold shale feeling like a mattress. "Keep moving," she told herself. "Left foot, right foot, breathe." They crossed the valley floor like a string of broken ants, completely exposed. If the shooter on the mountain wanted them dead, they were walking targets. Every time a pebble crunched too loudly under her boot, Camden expected the sudden, tearing crack of a high-velocity round. She expected her chest to cave in, but the shot never came. By the time they reached the base of the western peak, night had fully taken over. The sky was a brilliant, bruised canopy of stars, unfiltered by light pollution. Camden dropped to one knee behind a massive granite boulder, her chest heaving, lungs burning as if she were inhaling ground glass. She pulled her night vision goggles down over her eyes and hit the power switch. The world swam into a grainy, luminous green. "Switch to IR," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "Check your lasers. We're going into the rocks." Hayes and Reed silently complied. 3 thin, invisible beams of infrared light cut through the darkness, sweeping the jagged incline above them. "I take point," Camden said. She didn't look at Hayes to ask for permission. He didn't offer any. He just nodded, his eyes hollow and distant behind his goggles. The climb up the western peak was a vertical nightmare. The rock faces were steep and unforgiving, requiring them to sling their weapons and pull themselves up by hand. Camden's tactical gloves were shredded, the rough granite biting into her raw fingers. She moved mechanically, letting survival instinct override the screaming protests of her nervous system. Halfway up, she caught a scent on the wind. It stopped her dead in her tracks. She flattened herself against a narrow ledge, raising a fist to halt the men behind her. It wasn't cordite. It wasn't the metallic tang of blood or the sour smell of unwashed bodies. It was tobacco, rich, sweet pipe tobacco, carried on a downward thermal draft. It was such a jarringly domestic, civilized smell in the middle of a war zone that Camden's brain struggled to process it. It belonged in a leather-bound study in London, not on a blood-soaked mountain in the middle of nowhere. She tightened her grip on her rifle, thumbing the selector switch off safe. "They're close," she breathed. Gravel crunched softly beneath Camden's boots as she crested the false summit. The wind was howling up here, biting through her damp uniform, chilling the sweat on her spine to ice. Through the green phosphor of her NVGs, the terrain looked like the surface of the moon. Craters, jagged spires, and deep, impenetrable shadows. She moved with agonizing slowness, placing each foot carefully to avoid kicking loose stones. Her rifle was tucked tight into her shoulder, the IR laser sweeping the rocks in a slow, methodical arc. She found the hide by accident. If she hadn't tripped over the camouflage netting, she would have walked right past it. The setup was a masterpiece of fieldcraft. A shallow depression between two massive boulders had been roofed over with a thermal blanket, dirt, and scrub brush, blending seamlessly into the natural topography. It was a spider hole, designed to defeat both visual and thermal optics. Camden knelt beside it, her heart hammering against her ribs. She signaled Hayes and Reed, pointing down into the dark recess. Slowly, she nudged the edge of the netting aside with the barrel of her M4, empty. She slid into the depression, the space barely large enough to fit a single person lying prone. The smell of pipe tobacco was stronger here, mixed with the sharp, acidic tang of burnt powder. Her hand brushed against something cold and cylindrical in the dirt. She picked it up and held it close to her face, peering at it through her goggles. It was a brass casing, but it was massive, easily the length of her hand, thick and heavy. "416 Barrett," Reed whispered, sliding into the trench behind her and looking at the brass over her shoulder. "Antimateriel. Good out to 2,000 meters. Jesus." Camden swept her hand across the dirt floor. She found 3 more casings, perfectly arranged in a neat row. Not scattered, placed. The shooter hadn't left in a panic. They had taken the time to organize their trash before vanishing. "Who leaves their brass lined up like that?" Hayes muttered, his voice tight with an edge of paranoia. "Someone who isn't afraid of being followed," Camden replied. She examined the rest of the nest. There was a smooth depression in the dirt where a bipod had rested. Beside it, a crushed juice box. Apple flavor. The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. An apple juice box and a rifle capable of punching through an armored personnel carrier at 1.5 miles. "They're gone," Reed said, leaning back against the dirt wall and sliding down until he was sitting. He pulled off his helmet, running a trembling hand over his close-cropped hair. "Whoever it was, they took their shots and bugged out. We're alone again." "No, you're not." The voice came from directly above them. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the wind like a razor blade. It was a dry, raspy baritone, carrying a distinct American drawl that sounded entirely too relaxed for the situation. Camden reacted purely on instinct. She whipped her rifle upward, her IR laser slicing into the darkness at the top of the boulder, her finger taking up the slack on the trigger. Hayes and Reed brought their weapons up a fraction of a second later. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the voice said. Camden stared through her optic. Sitting casually on top of the boulder that formed the roof of the hide, his legs dangling over the edge, was a man. He was wearing a battered, dust-colored ghillie suit that looked like it had been dragged through hell and back, but the hood was pulled back. He wasn't wearing night vision. He was just looking down at them. In his hands, resting comfortably across his knees, was an incredibly compact, suppressed submachine gun. The muzzle was pointed loosely at Camden's chest. "Take the laser off my face, sweetheart," the man said, taking a slow drag from a small wooden pipe. The ember glowed dull red in the darkness, illuminating a face lined with deep crevices and a thick, greying beard. "It's bad manners, especially after I just pulled your asses out of the fire." Camden didn't move the laser. "Identify yourself," the man chuckled. It was a dry, rattling sound. "You're in no position to demand ID. You've got 3 magazines between the 3 of you. The kid on the left has a concussion. Your officer looks like he's about to have a psychotic break. And you're shaking so hard from adrenaline withdrawal, you can barely keep that red dot on my nose." Camden gritted her teeth. He was right. Her arms were burning, and the rifle felt like it weighed 50 pounds. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Name's Shepherd," the man said. He tapped the bowl of his pipe against the heel of his boot, sending a shower of orange sparks down into the wind. "I'm a private contractor. Agricultural management, mostly." "Agricultural management?" Reed blurted out. "Yeah," Shepherd said, picking up the massive, suppressed Barrett sniper rifle that was lying flat on the rock next to him, like a sleeping dog. He slung it effortlessly over his shoulder. "I pull weeds, and down there," he pointed a thumb back towards the ravine, "was a very big patch of weeds." "You were up here alone?" Hayes asked, finding his voice. "No spotter? No element?" Shepherd looked down at Hayes, his eyes hard and completely devoid of warmth. "Spotters talk too much. Elements get you killed. Now, if you 3 are done waving your plastic toys at me, we have a problem." He slid off the boulder, dropping into the hide with a surprisingly quiet thud for a man of his size. Up close, he smelled intensely of stale sweat, gun oil, and that sweet tobacco. He towered over Camden, easily 6'4", moving with a fluid, predatory grace that belied his age. "What problem?" Camden asked, finally lowering her weapon a few inches. Shepherd reached into a pouch on his chest rig and pulled out a battered tablet. He tapped the cracked screen, bringing up a thermal drone feed. "The guys I just turned into pink mist. They were the advanced scouting party," Shepherd said, tapping a cluster of bright white thermal blooms, moving steadily across the screen. "That is a mechanized convoy. 4 heavy gun trucks, 2 APCs, and roughly 50 dismounts. They heard the RPG. They're coming up the valley road. They'll be at your dead buddy's location in exactly 12 minutes. Camden felt her stomach drop out. She stared at the thermal blooms. It was an overwhelming force. "They'll track our blood trails right up this mountain," Hayes said, panic bleeding back into his voice. "Yes, they will," Shepherd agreed pleasantly. "Which is why I'm leaving. I suggest you do the same, assuming your legs still work." Shepherd didn't wait for a response. He turned his back on them, grabbing a canvas rucksack from the corner of the hide and throwing it over his shoulders. "Wait," Camden said, stepping in front of him. "Where are you going? We have wounded. We need an exfil route." Shepherd looked at her, his expression flat. "I'm not a medevac flight, kid. I don't have a helicopter in my back pocket. I have a dirt bike stashed 2 miles from here, and it only has 1 seat. You can't just leave us," Reed said, his voice cracking. "We're Tier 1. You're an American. You have a duty to assist." Shepherd stopped. He slowly turned his head to look at Reed. The temperature in the hide seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "Duty," Shepherd repeated softly. The word sounded dirty in his mouth. "I did my duty. I spent 20 years doing my duty in places you couldn't find on a map. You know what it got me? A blown-out L4 vertebra and a pension that barely covers my whiskey tab. I don't work for the flag anymore, son. I work for the paycheck." "Then we'll pay you," Hayes blurted out. Shepherd snorted. "With what? Your good looks? The DoD doesn't authorize field bounties for saving stranded squids." "I have a platinum card," Hayes said, dead serious. Shepherd stared at him for a long moment, then burst into a genuine, rattling laugh. It was a terrible sound, entirely devoid of humor. A platinum card. That's a new one. Tell you what, officer, keep your card. He brushed past Camden, stepping out of the hide and onto the narrow goat path that wound around the backside of the mountain. I'm heading north to the border, Shepard said over his shoulder, not slowing his pace. It's a 10-mile hike over rough terrain. If you can keep up, I won't shoot you. If you fall behind, I won't wait. If you make noise, I'll drop you myself. Are we clear? Camden looked at Hayes and Reed. They were battered, broken, and running on fumes. A 10-mile hike through the mountains in the dark, pursued by a mechanized company, was essentially a death sentence, but staying was a guaranteed execution. Clear, Camden said. She didn't wait for the men. She stepped out of the hide and followed the ghost. The next 3 hours were a blur of agonizing, mind-numbing pain. Shepard moved like a mountain goat, navigating the treacherous, uneven terrain with frustrating ease. He didn't use night vision. He seemed to navigate by memory and the faint starlight, his boots never kicking a stone, his breathing never growing labored. Camden, on the other hand, felt like she was dying by degrees. Her bruised knee swelled until her pant leg grew tight, sending sharp, electric spikes of agony up her spine with every step. Her throat felt completely coated in sand. She kept her eyes glued to the dark shape of Shepard's rucksack in front of her, making it her entire world. Just to the rock, she told herself. Just to the next bush. Behind her, Reed was stumbling. She could hear his boots dragging in the dirt. Hayes was silent, but his breathing sounded wet, like he was working through an asthma attack. Every time they reached a crest, Shepard would stop, drop to one knee, and pull out a massive pair of thermal binoculars. He would scan the valley behind them, perfectly still, before getting back up and moving on without a word. During one of these pauses, Camden collapsed against a shale embankment, fighting the urge to vomit from the sheer physical exertion. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. She looked back. Far below them, deep in the valley they had abandoned, bright shafts of yellow light pierced the darkness. The enemy convoy had arrived at the ravine. Through her NVGs, she could see the distant, tiny flashes of IR lasers sweeping the rocks where they had been pinned down. They had found Gallagher, a heavy, sick feeling twisted in Camden's gut. She pictured the enemy fighters swarming over his body, pulling off his gear, taking trophies. A part of her hated herself for leaving him. The training drilled it into your head. No man left behind. But reality was a cruel teacher. Reality dictated that dead meat didn't weigh down the living. Shepard lowered his binoculars and looked down at her. "They're burning him," he said quietly. Camden's head snapped up. "What?" "Your boy," Shepard said, nodding towards the valley. "They dragged him out of the ditch. They're pouring gas on him." Camden scrambled up the embankment, ripping her NVGs off and pulling her own small optic from her pouch. She focused it on the valley floor. A bright orange fire bloomed in the darkness. It was too small for a vehicle fire. It was the size of a man. Small figures danced around it in the thermal glow, raising their rifles in the air. Camden felt a sudden, violent surge of rage. It cut through the fatigue, through the pain, through the cynical detachment she had built up over 3 deployments. It was a pure, white-hot fury that tasted like copper in the back of her throat. "I'm going back," she whispered, dropping her optic. "No, you're not," Shepard said. "They're desecrating his body." "He's dead, kid," Shepard said, his voice entirely devoid of sympathy. "He doesn't care. He's carbon and water. You go down there, you become carbon and water too." "I have 60 rounds," Camden said, grabbing her rifle. "I can reach the ridge in 20 minutes. I can drop 5 of them before they even know I'm there." Shepard moved so fast she didn't even see it. 1 second he was standing 10 feet away. The next, his hand was wrapped around the barrel of her M4, forcing it down with strength that felt like hydraulic pressure. "You listen to me, you stupid boot," he hissed, his face inches from hers. The smell of tobacco and stale sweat washed over her. "You think this is a movie? You think you're going to get some glorious payback? You go down there, they will shoot your legs off, they will strip you naked, and they will keep you alive for 3 days while they broadcast it on the internet. And then they will burn you, too." Camden tried to yank the rifle back, but his grip was like a vice. "Look at your team," Shepard said, jerking his head toward Hayes and Reed. Camden looked. Reed was sitting in the dirt, his head between his knees, shivering uncontrollably. Hayes was leaning against a rock, staring blankly at the fire in the valley, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his face. "They are broken," Shepard said softly. "You are the only thing keeping them putting one foot in front of the other. You go play martyr. They die here in the cold. Is that what your dead buddy would want?" Camden stared into Shepard's eyes. They were cold, flat, and ancient. They were the eyes of a man who had seen every terrible thing the world had to offer and had simply stopped caring. Slowly, she released the tension on her rifle. Shepard let go of the barrel. He stepped back, adjusting his rucksack. "Good choice," he grunted. "Now wipe your face, hydrate, and keep walking. We have 6 miles left, and the sun comes up in 4 hours. If we're caught in the open when the light hits, we're all going to be firewood." He turned and disappeared into the darkness. Camden stood there for a second, looking at the distant fire. She forced herself to burn the image into her mind. She didn't want to forget it. She wanted it to hurt. She slung her rifle, walked over to Reed, and grabbed him by the shoulder rigging, hauling him roughly to his feet. "Get up," she growled. Reed groaned, swaying on his feet. "I can't, Cam. I'm done." "You're not done until I say you're done," she snapped. "Move your legs, Reed. Walk." She shoved him forward, then turned to Hayes. The officer was still staring at the fire. Camden stepped into his line of sight, blocking it. "Sir," she said, her voice hard, "we are moving." Hayes blinked, looking at her as if he didn't recognize her. Then, slowly, he nodded. They followed the ghost deeper into the mountains, leaving the fire and the last of their humanity. Behind them, in the dust, boots scraped against the limestone, a sound that drilled directly into the base of Camden's skull. It was a rhythmic, agonizing grind. Drag, step, pause, drag, step, pause. Time had stopped functioning linearly hours ago. It was measured only in the space between breaths, in the sharp, stabbing pain radiating from her swollen knee, and in the sheer, terrifying drop-offs that Shepard navigated without a second glance. The air had grown incredibly thin, biting cold, carrying the faint metallic scent of ozone that preceded a mountain freeze. Camden's plate carrier felt like it was filled with lead shot. The padded shoulder straps had long ago chewed through her combat shirt, rubbing the skin over her collarbones completely raw. Every time she reached up to adjust the rifle sling, a hot spike of friction burned across the open blisters. She welcomed it. The pain meant she wasn't freezing to death. It meant the blood was still pumping, however sluggishly, through her veins. "I can't." The whisper was so faint, Camden almost missed it over the wind. She turned. Reed was down. He hadn't tripped. His legs had simply ceased to operate. He knelt in the scree, his rifle lying in the dirt beside him, his chin resting against his chest. His night vision goggles were pushed up on his helmet, revealing eyes that were glassy, tracking something that wasn't there. A thin line of drool connected his bottom lip to the collar of his jacket. Camden limped back to him, her quads trembling violently with the change in momentum. "Reed, up!" He didn't blink. "Tell Sarah she needs to check the tires on the Subaru. The tread is low." "Shut up about the car, Reed. Get on your feet." She grabbed his rig, pulling upward. He felt like dead weight. 190 pounds of muscle bone and tactical gear completely disconnected from his central nervous system. "She forgets," Reed mumbled, his voice carrying a childlike earnestness. "She always forgets the tires, Cam. It's dangerous in the rain." "Hayes," Camden grunted, her boots sliding backward in the loose rocks as she tried to hoist Reed by herself. "Hayes, help me." Hayes was standing 10 feet away, staring out into the pitch-black void of the canyon. He looked over slowly. His face was a mask of chalky dust and dried blood, completely hollowed out. He didn't move. He just watched her struggle, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The command structure hadn't just broken, it had evaporated into the thin mountain air. Up ahead, the dark silhouette of Shepard paused. He turned, the faint starlight catching the battered suppressor of his submachine gun. He walked back down the slope, his steps silent, predatory. He looked at Reed, then at Camden. "Leave him," Shepard said. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a logistical fact. "No," Camden spat, wrapping her arm under Reed's armpit. "He's concussed, severely dehydrated and going into shock," Shepard stated, tapping the ash from his pipe onto a rock. "His brain is swelling. He isn't going to make the ridge. You carry him, you burn the last 10% of your caloric reserves in 20 minutes. Then you die next to him." "I am not leaving him." Camden glared at the contractor. "I already left one." Shepard sighed, a dry, rattling sound. "Pride is a luxury for people with full stomachs and close air support, sweetheart. You want to die for a Subaru. Be my guest." He turned his back to them, looking up at the sky. The eastern horizon was no longer black. It was bleeding out into a pale, sickly slate grey. Dawn was coming. The thermal crossover, the brief window where the ground temperature matched the air temperature, blinding thermal optics, was ending. Soon the sun would cast long, exposing shadows across the valley, illuminating them like roaches on a white tile floor. "Wait," Shepard hissed, suddenly dropping into a low crouch. Camden froze. She strained her ears over the howl of the wind. At first, she felt it rather than heard it. A low, vibrating hum, like a hornet trapped inside a tin can. It was coming from the valley below, rising steadily along the thermal drafts. Drones. "Under the rock! Now!" Shepard barked, grabbing Hayes by the collar and practically throwing the officer into a shallow fissure between two massive granite slabs. Camden didn't hesitate. Adrenaline, toxic and hot, flooded her veins, overriding the exhaustion. She grabbed Reed by the drag handle on his plate carrier and hauled him backward, ignoring his groans of pain. She shoved him into the fissure, collapsing on top of his legs, just as Shepard slid in beside her. From his rucksack, Shepard yanked a large, crinkling sheet of mylar space blanket, coated on one side with a heavy layer of dirt and local foliage. He pulled it over the opening of the crevice, plunging them into absolute darkness. "Do not move, do not breathe," Shepard whispered. The hum grew louder. It transformed into a high-pitched mechanical whine. Quadcopters, commercial grade, probably rigged with crude thermal cameras and mortar shells. They were cheap, expendable, and terrifyingly efficient. Under the tarp, the air instantly grew suffocating. The smell was horrendous. 4 unwashed bodies, stale blood, nervous sweat, and the sharp, chemical reek of fear. Camden was pressed shoulder to shoulder with Shepard. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his heart against her arm. It wasn't racing. It was beating with the calm, measured pace of a man waiting for a bus. Her own heart was a jackhammer in her throat. She closed her eyes, trying to regulate her breathing. Breathe in, hold, breathe out. The whine of the rotors passed directly overhead. It was so close, Camden swore she could feel the displacement of the air through the tarp. If the thermal shielding had a single tear in it, if Reed shifted and exposed a boot, They were dead. A mortar shell dropped into this fissure would turn them all into a slurry of bone and Kevlar. Reed shifted. He let out a low, confused moan. Camden clamped her hand over his mouth instantly. Her bruised fingers dug into his cheek, pressing his lips hard against his teeth. He squirmed weakly, fighting for air. She pressed harder, ignoring the sticky feeling of the blood drying on his chin. "Don't make me kill you to save you, Reed," she thought, panic squeezing her chest. Above them, the drone hovered. It paused. A mechanical clicking sound echoed down through the rocks, the camera gimbal panning across the false summit. Seconds stretched into years. The darkness under the tarp felt heavy, pressing down on her eyeballs. Finally, the pitch of the rotors changed. The drone banked away, the hum fading as it continued its sweep down the ridgeline. Nobody moved for a full 2 minutes. Shepard slowly peeled the tarp back. The grey light of early dawn hit Camden's eyes like a physical blow. She blinked rapidly, her vision swimming with purple spots. "They know our vector," Shepard said, quietly folding the tarp and shoving it back into his pack. "The drones were just the dogs. The hunters are right behind them. Get your boy up. We have a mile left." Camden looked at Reed. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and erratic. She couldn't carry him a mile, not uphill, not in this terrain. She looked at Hayes. The officer was staring at his own hands again. Shepard unslung his SMG. He didn't point it at anyone. He just rested the barrel against his boot, looking at Camden with those dead, ancient eyes. "The math doesn't change just because you want it to, kid," Shepard said softly. 1 mile, broad daylight. You can walk out of here, or you can stay here and die holding his hand. Make a choice." They left Reed in the crevice. Camden didn't cry. She didn't say a prayer. She took his remaining magazine, stripped his canteens, and tucked his dog tags into her chest pocket. The metal was cold against her skin. She draped his survival blanket over him, knowing it wouldn't stop the enemy, but hoping it might hide him long enough for the swelling in his brain to kill him peacefully before they found him. She didn't look back as she followed Shepard up the final incline. Her mind went completely blank, entering a state of pure, mechanical dissociation. She was no longer a person. She was a biological machine programmed to put one foot in front of the other. The terrain flattened out into a jagged plateau. To their right, a sheer drop-off plunged hundreds of feet into a dried riverbed. To their left, a towering wall of impassable red sandstone. They were in a natural corridor. "The border is the river," Shepard grunted, not looking back. "We cross the dry bed. We hit the tree line on the other side. They won't follow us into the timber. Jurisdiction issues." "Since when do they care about lines on a map?" Hayes croaked. It was the first coherent sentence he had spoken in hours. "Since the country on the other side of that timber has a mechanized border patrol that shoots first and asks questions never," Shepard replied. The sky cracked open, bleeding brilliant streaks of orange and gold across the clouds. It was a beautiful sunrise. Camden hated it. The light stripped away their only cover, exposing them on the plateau like insects under a magnifying glass. They were 200 yards from the switchback that led down to the riverbed, when the canyon behind them echoed with the sharp, staccato bark of a dog. Not a drone, a Malinois, fast, vicious, and tracking their scent. "Contact rear," Camden yelled, her voice completely hoarse. She spun, dropping to one knee, throwing her rifle onto her shoulder. Through her optic, she saw movement at the crest of the false summit they had just crossed. Half a mile back, small, dark shapes moving rapidly through the shale. "Keep moving," Shepard roared. The casual drawl was gone, replaced by a booming, authoritative bark that demanded absolute obedience. Camden didn't move. She couldn't. If they ran now, they would be shot in the back before they reached the switchback. Someone had to lay down suppressing fire. The first enemy fighter crested the ridge, a massive dog straining at the end of a long lead. Camden exhaled, putting the red dot center mass on the handler. She squeezed the trigger. Click. A misfire. A bad primer. Dust in the chamber. It didn't matter. The sound of the hammer falling on a dead round was the loudest noise in the world. Panic flared, hot and bright. She tilted the rifle, ripping the charging handle back. The bad round ejected, spinning into the dirt. She let the bolt slam forward, driving a fresh round into the chamber, reacquired the target, and fired. The recoil punched her bruised shoulder. The handler stumbled, dropping the leash. The dog, freed, bolted forward, closing the distance over the rocks with terrifying speed. Camden tracked the dog, firing twice. She missed. The beast was too fast, a blur of muscle and teeth against the grey rock. Suddenly, a massive pressure wave slammed into the side of her head. It was a physical force, blowing her hair sideways and instantly popping her eardrums. A nanosecond later, the deafening, earth-shattering boom of Shepard's .416. Barrett rolled over her. The dog didn't just fall, it disintegrated. The high-velocity, armor-piercing round hit it mid-stride, turning the animal into a chaotic spray of red mist and tumbling fur. Camden gasped, clapping a hand over her ear. Warm blood trickled out, running down her jawline. The concussion from the muzzle brake was blinding. "Ears, damn it," Shepard yelled, though it sounded to Camden like he was speaking underwater. He was prone on the dirt. The massive bipod of the Barrett dug firmly into the rock. He worked the bolt with fluid, mechanical precision. An empty brass casing the size of a cigar tube flew out, bouncing off the sandstone. Boom! Another pressure wave. Half a mile away, the engine block of an approaching enemy ATV exploded in a shower of sparks and black smoke, throwing its rider violently over the handlebars. "Go!" Shepard yelled, racking the bolt again. "Down the switchback. I'll hold the choke." Camden grabbed Hayes by his harness, pulling him toward the edge of the plateau. They scrambled down the steep, treacherous switchback, sliding on their backsides, sending avalanches of loose rock tumbling into the dried riverbed below. Above them, the Barrett fired a third time, then a fourth. It was a terrifying rhythm, the sound of a wrathful god bringing down thunder. Mixed in with it was the frantic, high-pitched crackle of incoming AK fire as the enemy desperately tried to suppress the sniper. Rounds began snapping around Camden and Hayes. They weren't aimed. The enemy couldn't see them over the lip of the plateau, but the plunging fire was lethal nonetheless. Pieces of sandstone exploded around them, showering them with razor-sharp fragments. Hayes suddenly cried out, stumbling forward and collapsing face first into the dirt. "Hayes!" Camden slid to a stop, scrambling back up to him. He rolled over, clutching his upper arm. Blood was soaking rapidly through his uniform sleeve, bright and arterial. A stray round had caught his bicep, tearing a neat groove through the muscle. The smell of copper hit Camden's nose, mixed with the acrid stench of burnt fabric. "I'm hit," Hayes gasped, his eyes wide, the shock momentarily clearing the mental fog. "Cam, I'm hit." "It's a through and through," she lied, grabbing his good arm. "Bite down. We are not dying on this hill." She practically dragged him the rest of the way down. They hit the bottom of the gorge, their boots sinking into the fine, powdery sand of the dried riverbed. The river was 40 yards across. No cover, just open sand, baking under the rising sun. Across the bed, the thick green timber of the border forest loomed like a mirage. "Run," she told him. They staggered across the sand, completely exposed. Camden kept her rifle pointed backward, walking sideways, her eyes locked on the rim of the plateau high above. Suddenly the firing stopped. The deafening roar of the Barrett ceased. The incoming AK fire trailed off. The canyon fell into an eerie, ringing silence, broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing and the crunch of sand under their boots. Camden and Hayes reached the tree line, collapsing into the thick, damp ferns. The shade was icy cold. Camden rolled onto her back, aiming her rifle up at the canyon rim, waiting for the enemy to pour over the edge. Minute after minute passed. Nothing moved. "Where is he?" Hayes whispered, clutching his bleeding arm. Camden didn't answer. She kept the red dot steady, her arms shaking so violently she could barely see through the optic. Had they overrun him? Had the ghost finally caught a bullet he couldn't dodge? A cascade of pebbles tumbled down the switchback. Camden tightened her finger on the trigger. A figure emerged from the dust. It was Shepherd. He was moving fast, sliding down the rocks with reckless speed. The Barrett was slung across his back, bouncing heavily against his rucksack. He hit the riverbed and sprinted across the sand, not looking back. He reached the tree line and pushed past Camden, not even slowing down. "Get up," he growled. "They're waiting for heavy mortars. They're going to level that plateau in about 3 minutes." The extraction point was 3 miles deep into the timber. It wasn't a military base. It wasn't a fortified bunker. It was a crumbling, moss-covered concrete hunting blind left over from a war fought 50 years ago. Hidden beneath a massive pile of dead brush and a camouflage tarp was a battered, matte-black dirt bike. It smelled strongly of gasoline, damp earth and pine needles. Camden sat on a decaying log, watching numbly as Shepherd efficiently packed his gear. He didn't check on Hayes's arm. He didn't offer them water. He just strapped the massive sniper rifle into a custom scabbard on the side of the bike and checked the fuel valve. Hayes was sitting against the concrete wall, wrapping a field dressing tightly around his bicep. He winced with every pull, but the colour had somewhat returned to his face. The physical pain seemed to have finally grounded him, snapping the psychological tether that had left him drifting. "There's an emergency beacon in the saddlebag," Shepherd said, not looking at them as he kicked the dirt bike's stand-up. "It's encrypted. Hit the button, wait 4 hours, and one of those fancy black helicopters you kids love so much will come pick you up." Camden stared at his back. The exhaustion was setting in now, deep in her marrow. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a profound, aching emptiness. "You're just going to leave?" she asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of anger or gratitude. Shepherd swung his leg over the seat and settled his weight onto the suspension. He pulled a fresh pipe from his vest, clamped it between his teeth, and finally looked at her. Without the shadows of the mountain, in the dappled sunlight of the forest, he just looked old. Deep, permanent lines carved his face, etched by decades of stress, sun, and things he chose not to talk about. There was no heroism in his eyes. There was only the weary endurance of a man who had survived entirely too long. "Job's done," Shepherd said. "I saved you. You survived. That's the transaction." "What about Reed?" Hayes asked, his voice cracking. "What about Gallagher?" Shepherd fired up the dirt bike. The engine roared to life, a loud, obnoxious 2-stroke whine that shattered the peace of the forest. Blue exhaust smoke plumed into the air, smelling of oil and freedom. He revved the engine, leaning over the handlebars. "They're dust," Shepherd said, raising his voice over the engine noise. "Just like the guys I shot, just like will be eventually. Do yourself a favor, kid. Don't write a book about it. Nobody back home wants to know what it actually takes to survive out here. They just want the medals and the parades." He didn't wait for a salute. He popped the clutch and tore off down the narrow, overgrown hunting trail, dodging roots and pines, until the sound of the engine faded into a distant mosquito whine, leaving them completely alone. Camden sat in the silence. The forest was peaceful. Birds chirped in the canopy overhead. A gentle breeze rustled the ferns. It felt entirely wrong. The world should have been on fire. She reached into her chest pocket and pulled out Reed's dog tags. She ran her thumb over the stamped metal. She thought about Gallagher choking on his own blood in the ravine. She thought about Reed, hallucinating about his wife's Subaru in the dark, left to die under a space blanket. She thought about the heavy, concussive boom of a weapon tearing men apart, and the terrible, beautiful silence that followed it. Slowly, heavily, Camden reached into the saddlebag of the bike, pulled out the emergency beacon, and pressed the button. A tiny green light began to blink, connecting them back to the world they had left behind. She leaned her head back against the rough bark of a pine tree and closed her eyes. She was alive. She was breathing. But as she sat there in the damp dirt, smelling the pine and the blood and the drying sweat, she realized Shepard was right. A piece of her had burned in that valley. The woman who had worried about curdled milk on a kitchen counter in Virginia Beach was gone. Whoever the helicopter was coming to pick up, it wasn't her. If this gritty, boots-on-the-ground story kept your heart pounding, you know what to do. Stories like this pull no punches, showing the raw, brutal reality of survival and the heavy toll of coming home. We pour our blood, sweat, and tactical research into bringing you these deeply human narratives. And your support is the only thing keeping the mission alive. Don't let this story fade into the static. Smash that like button, share this video with your squad, and subscribe to the channel for more uncompromising, adrenaline-fueled military drama. Hit the bell so you never miss and drop.